suicide is an extremely serious and important topic. And we're going to take the opportunity now to focus on suicide prevention, and making people aware of the help available to them, and how to talk to friends and loved ones who may be affected. With me to take us through this is Mick Collins. Mick is Resource Officer for Suicide Prevention with HSE Midwest Mental Health Services. Mick, thank you so much for joining us on the programme.
Good morning, Alan. Thanks very much to you and to Clare FM for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with you this morning. I think it's really important that we can have these conversations. They're quite difficult conversations, but I think it's really important that we have them.
That is for sure. And just to kick things off, Mick, I mean, when we use that phrase suicide prevention, what do we actually mean by that in practical everyday terms?
Yes, just I suppose I can give it a little bit of context, Alan. I work for the HSE. I work in the Office for Suicide Prevention, and we sit within the Mental Health Services here in the HSE Midwest, and we cover Limerick, Clare and North Tipperary. The Office for Suicide Prevention is a small office. There's a small team of us here, and we work in the area of suicide, and that involves suicide prevention, intervention and postvention. And those areas are areas that we all need to be aware of, and we all can play a part in. The reality and unfortunate reality is that suicide happens, and it impacts on a significant amount of people, families and communities. And to that point in particular, I want to offer my sympathies to anybody who has been bereaved by suicide, either recently or in the past.
I said in my introduction, Mick, that suicide's serious, it's important. It's also an uncomfortable topic. But despite that, why is it important to talk not just about suicide, but talk openly about it?
Well, having conversations about a subject that's so sensitive and so difficult is really important. There is a significant stigma around in relation to mental health, but in relation to suicide in particular. It's a subject a lot of people will shy away from. It's a subject that they're not comfortable talking about, whether it's about fears that, having the conversation with somebody might put the idea into their minds, for example. Whereas actually, fortunately, what we know is to be able to have a conversation with somebody, an open and frank conversation with somebody about suicide, about thoughts about taking their own lives, can actually be very helpful and can be very supportive to a person. So breaking down the stigma that's attached to it, because stigma is a real challenge, because stigma can come from a person themselves, or it can come from the community, or it can come from society. So if we can tackle that stigma and begin to break down that stigma, it will be a really good step in terms of raising awareness, improving people's confidence about having those really difficult conversations. Because the other thing about stigma is that it stops people accessing the supports and the resources that are there.
I want to ask you about the psychology behind suicide. What can lead to someone feeling that it is their only option? And would I be wide of the mark to say that suicidal thoughts can be quite often linked to overwhelming emotional pain rather than an actual desire to die?
Absolutely. What we know is that people can experience suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation at any point in their lives, but it's often associated with an episode of distress, and that distress could be extreme distress, and that distress could be as a result of a range of challenges or difficulties that an individual might be experiencing. Suicide is really complex. There's often no one reason why a person will experience suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation. And that's the part that we need to try and understand a little bit more, that anybody can experience suicidal thoughts at some point during their lives. And as I said, it's often connected to something that might be really distressing or difficult for them at that particular time. It could be situational, for example. It could be to do with a job loss. It could be to do with financial losses. It can often be to do with relationship breakdown and or social isolation. It can often be stressful life events that the family might be experiencing. So it can be events that could be occurring in a person's life. Can also be stigma associated with help seeking, and that can be a barrier for people as well. We know there are certain particular groups that are more vulnerable to suicide. Unfortunately, men, there are always higher rates in men than women. It's approximately a 3-to-1 ratio. We know that. We know that people who have experienced mental health difficulties are more vulnerable to suicide. We also know that people who have struggled with, for example, alcohol or drugs, addictions, they're also more vulnerable. People that have attempted, have self-harmed or attempted suicide previously are also at a higher risk. So there's a range of people that are more vulnerable to suicide and experience those challenges more frequently.
Mick, what are some of the warning signs that someone might be struggling or at risk? I'm sure people would be keen to find this out so they can be more aware and more cognizant of seeing these signs. Are there changes in behaviour and mood that are perhaps more important for someone to notice than what someone is actually saying? Even on what they're saying, they might make a comment, it might sound like a joke or an offhand remark about not wanting to be here. How seriously should someone take those remarks?
Really important that if somebody that you know or aware of has made those types of comments about not wanting to be around, I've got a way to sort this. If they make those statements, they're really important, and it's really important that we listen to people when they make those kinds of comments. Yes, absolutely. Warning signs are really important, and because people think, oh gosh, we didn't know that somebody was struggling. We weren't aware that they were having difficulties. But what we know is that there have often been subtle changes in how a person deals with those challenges. For example, a person when they're in distress will often give out some forms of an invitation, and an invitation is it could be a comment, it could be a change in behaviour, which gives another person an opportunity to engage with them and talk around that. So the changes I'm talking about could be changes in how a person thinks or talks about the world. They might be more pessimistic. They mightn't be very hopeful about their future. They might talk about giving away some of their possessions. They might seem disinterested and not engage around making future plans, for example. So if somebody is making those kinds of references, they need to be taken really seriously. And what a person like that is trying to communicate the level of distress that they might be in, but they might not be able to do it in any other particular way. For some people, you might have other changes in their life. They may be engaging in self-harm. They might be excessively drinking or using substances. They might be engaging in gambling. They might be risk-taking behaviours. There's lots of different signs that a person might be struggling, and we would consider those are the opportunities to try and engage with somebody when they display those types of conversations or behaviours as an opportunity to start to have a conversation with them about what's going on in their world at that time.
And in terms of that conversation, a lot of people, I think, Mick, would understandably want to have that conversation with someone, but they would just worry, given the seriousness of the situation, about saying the wrong thing. How do you go about starting a conversation with someone you're worried about? And is it ever okay to just come out and directly ask someone if they're feeling suicidal?
Well, actually, it's really important, Alan, and I think this is a really important point. Asking somebody about suicide is one of the most powerful statements that you can say to somebody, because it it might be a situation that the person is contemplating, and they might want the opportunity to have the conversation. So there are people that are often put off having the conversation, having those important conversations with somebody, because they think they might put the idea into somebody's mind, whereas actually it's the opposite. It actually can be very helpful and freeing for a person if somebody asks them if they're thinking about taking their own life. Yes, it's really difficult, but it's really important, and that's one of the areas of the work that we do here in our office, is that we offer and deliver a series of free suicide awareness and prevention trainings. And our first level training that we offer is an online course called Let's Talk About Suicide. And in the name, it's quite there. So it's let's have a conversation about suicide, and let's start to have that conversation so we can get that out on the table. So that first level training, Let's Talk About Suicide, helps people to address the issue of suicide. It helps them raise awareness about suicide. It helps the person have the confidence to be able to ask the questions of somebody that might be vulnerable. So it increases awareness, it helps the people have a conversation, and it talks them through the different stages of how they can support somebody that might be vulnerable. So it starts with giving the person permission to have a conversation and the permission just to talk. And it talks about using listening skills and listening with empathy and compassion to let them talk about the distress. And then what happens next, it allows the listener to validate the experiences of what the person is telling them, because that's what they might be struggling with. You know, they may be overwhelmed with a range of different emotions and a range of different feelings. And what we do know as well, that the majority of people don't want to end their life, but they want to end the suffering or the distress that they're experiencing. So once somebody is able to go through those steps with somebody, the next step then is to help that person access the necessary resources that are available for them.
And it's good that you highlighted Let's Talk About Suicide. I gave out contact details for Pieta and Samaritans earlier on in the show, Mick. Just finally, what is the one thing you would most like our listeners to take away from this conversation this morning?
There's probably lots of things I'd like them to take away, Alan, and I think listening to Niall's story before this part was really powerful and really an amazing story of recovery, where somebody was really struggling and that they accessed help and that they were able to have a very positive and productive life afterwards. So that positive hope is what I would like for people to take away. I would also like people to understand that they can play a part in suicide reduction. When you think of one of the aims of working in this field is to make our communities more suicide safe. So we can do this by having conversations, by beginning to talk about this really difficult subject, but to talk about it in a way that shows understanding and that shows compassion. Because if people are experiencing suicidal ideation or suicidal intent, they're vulnerable and they need support, they need empathy, they need compassion. And they also need access to a range of supports that are out there. Unfortunately, in Clare, there's lots of supports for our communities out there.
Look, such an important issue to discuss, and this morning, particularly in light of my chat with Niall. Mick, thank you for having that with us, and I'm sure our listeners are very much enlightened after. Thank you for joining me on the show this morning.
You're very welcome, Alan, and happy to talk to you again at any time.
Thank you. Mick Collins there. Mick is Resource Officer for Suicide Prevention with HSE Midwest Mental Health Services.